lot of you know I'm a big reader, big history buff, and you think about the people who've really helped so many of us understand what's happened in our history in the last several decades. People like David McCullough, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Robert Caro, people like that. But then there's this whole new generation of writers who are coming forward, who are helping us understand lessons of history right now. And there's no one that I think is better in that generation of writers than Candice Millard. And I thought that before I found out that she lived just a few hours away. So when he told me that I would get to moderate this, my first thought that came to my mind was thinking of that Saturday Night Live episode where Chris Farley gets to interview Paul McCartney. Has anyone seen that? So, all those caveats aside, thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for coming.
You've written about Theodore Roosevelt. You've written about James A. Garfield, now Winston Churchill. How do you come up with the topics for the books that you write?
So I'm like all of you, I'm just reading all the time, and I always have an eye out for a great idea, and I have file folders full of ideas that will never see the light of day and should never see the light of day. But what I'm looking for in a story mostly is not just a great story, but a really, really strong story, a story that's strong enough that it can pull a lot with it. So, for instance, when I wrote The River of Doubt, I had been working at National Geographic for 6 years, and I see this story that has Theodore Roosevelt, and it has murder and drowning, and Roosevelt nearly takes his own life, and all these incredible things, and my first thought is, oh, I can talk about the Amazon, I can talk about evolution and natural history, because I was hoping that the story would be strong enough that people would stick with me through all this other stuff that I was interested in, so I could sort of be self-indulgent and talk about that. And the same with Destiny of the Public of James Garfield. I could talk about the changes, the tremendous changes in medicine at the time. And with this, the modernization of warfare and what it meant in South Africa. And so all of these stories, to me at least, they're tight, they're targeted, and I hope they're illuminating about the person and about this period in time.
And so like for this book, a lot of the events in this book occur in Great Britain or South Africa. So how do you go about, and they happened over a century ago, and how do you go about researching a book like that and writing it?
So that's actually my favorite part of the process, and I spend probably too much time with it. There comes a point in which I think, okay, I should wrap it up and maybe write the book eventually. So I love doing research, and I obviously do a lot of archival research, which is just amazing. You never know what you're going to find. So I did a lot of research in England. Obviously, the Churchill archives are in Cambridge. I went to Blenheim Palace, where he was born. They have archives there. The National Army Museum, the Kew Archives. But then I went to South Africa, and I spent several weeks there. And everywhere you go, there's some marker for a Boer War battlefield, or a memorial, or there's a museum or a library. But specifically to this story, I was able to go exactly to the place where Churchill was captured. I went to the place in Pretoria where he was kept as a POW. It's this building that is now a public library, and I remember watching this woman, sort of just browsing for books and thinking, oh my God, look up, there's history everywhere. There's this huge map drawn on the wall of one of these rooms. This was an officer's prison, and these guys were incredibly well-trained cartographers. So they drew a map of South Africa charting the course of the war, and it's still there. There's in the room where Churchill was kept as a prisoner, there is a trap door. And I stood in it. You lift it up and you can stand in it. And they had at one point thought about tunneling their way out under the street to the garden next door. And you can see where they very quickly hit water. I went to where he hid in a coal mine shaft for 3 days with white rats. I went into Mozambique, which is now then Portuguese East Africa. and that's where he made his way to freedom. So he traveled almost 300 miles by himself across enemy territory. No map, no compass, no food, no weapon, didn't speak the language. I mean, it's really this extraordinary story. And he made it to what was then Lorenzo Marx, it's now Maputo, and the British consulate, that building, same building that he went to. So it was so much fun and absolutely fascinating and really, really rich. I mean, it was just this rich, enormous, just treasure trove of primary source material to work with.
Not necessarily a lot of books have been written about him to writing.
Everybody knows Garfield.
to writing about Winston Churchill, who's right up there with Abraham Lincoln and Jesus for the number of books he's written. So, was that intimidating, thinking about that, when you were deciding?
It was extremely intimidating, extremely intimidating, very daunting, because not only are there so many books that have been written about Winston Churchill, but they're written by some of the greatest minds in history and biography, some of the greatest writers, not even counting Churchill himself, who has written about this time in his life in his book My Early Life, which is his biography about from his childhood to the 1900 this time, and it's just a fantastic book. So it was intimidating, but this story is such a great story in itself, but it's also, it truly is the making of Winston Churchill. So he ran for Parliament before the Boer War, and he lost. And during this escape made him a national hero. The Boers, to their shock and horror, were actually losing the war at this point, and they needed a hero, and Winston Churchill gave them one. And he very quickly, before the end of the war, ran for Parliament again and won, and it launched his political career. And it's also the beginning of modern warfare. So it's just a hugely important point in history, and an important point in, one of the most powerful, in the life of one of the most powerful and effective leaders in history.
And I think the way you start out the book talking about kind of the scope of the British Empire and how, he had no lack of opportunities to go and engage in different battles because they were so really overextended. Can you talk about I thought it was very interesting when you specifically pointed out just the overall scope of it. There really has not ever been an empire like that in human history. That's
right. So the British Empire was larger even than the Roman Empire at its zenith. It ruled over 450 million people, like a quarter of the planet. And because of that, it was stretched very, very thin, because along with colonialism comes a lot of revolts. And so they were constantly putting out revolts, from Ireland to Egypt, and stretched very thin because of that. But for Winston Churchill, who was born into the highest ranks of the British aristocracy at the height of the Victorian age, saw, obviously an unabashed imperialist, and believed that the British Empire was a benevolent force in the world and everybody would be better off being British, saw this incredible opportunity for himself. So by the time he goes to South Africa, he's 24 years old. This is his fourth war on 3 different continents. So he had gone to Cuba and was an observer, but nearly shot to death. The horse that was standing next to him was shot and killed, and bullets whistling by his head all the time. He had fought in British India, in Malakand. He had fought in Sudan, the Battle of Omdurman. He had killed men himself. He had watched his friends not just killed, but mutilated, sliced to ribbons. But still, he threw himself into the most brutal battles the British Empire had to offer again and again and again, because he thought it was his path to fame and to power, and he called it the glittering gateway to distinction.
And that was one of the things that really struck me in reading it is, one, that other soldiers are taking their break off from, their leave from one war, and he uses his leave to go to another. There's a point where he's hiding out in a mine surrounded by rats in total darkness, and he's thinking, he's excited because when he gets free, he can go fight in another war. What's driving him there? Is it that he wants material to write about, like a Hemingway type, or is it that he's looking for military glory, like Roosevelt? I mean, what's the drive there for him?
So he was always fascinated by war, and he always believed that he was destined for greatness. He told his mother he had faith in his star. So he was a direct descendant of the first Duke of Marlborough, who's considered perhaps the greatest general in British history. He, as a child, had 1,500 toy soldiers that he was always playing with, and so this is something he thought about all the time. He didn't go to university, he went to a military college, to Sandhurst. And he loved Sandhurst, and he loved the war games that they played, but he always thought it was such a shame that wasn't real, So his first opportunity to go to war, he did, and he did it with great enthusiasm. And I think mostly because he wanted medals, he wanted attention. In British India, he rode on a white pony on the battlefield just to get attention, just to get noticed. And he wasn't afraid. He didn't believe that he would be killed, even though he saw death all around him all the time, because he did believe in his star, and he did believe he was destined for greatness, and he thought that was his path to political power.
And so that experience going around, you write about it, I mean, seeing people right next to him be shot, seeing his friends mutilated and killed, and yet really nothing bad ever happens to him. Does that create the sense of destiny in him, because he feels a sense of destiny because he can see himself just moving through all these things, or did he have that in him before these incidents took place?
I think he had it in him before, and that certainly didn't help. It certainly confirmed that idea in him. But I think it's interesting with Winston Churchill. One of the things that I think is so powerful about this point in his life is that if you look at a picture of him, I mean, you wouldn't necessarily know that that's Winston Churchill. I mean, you think of him, you think of an old, overweight man, right, with that cigar in his teeth and a glass of whiskey in his hand, sending young men into war. So outside looks completely different. Inside is the same man. It's really extraordinary to read his letters at that time, because he just has this sense of who he is, where he's headed, how he's going to get there. I mean, I don't know what you were like at 23, 24, but I had
four different wars like everybody else has. Right?
Yeah, and he's also by this time, by the way, also written 3 books and run for parliament. So he's a little bit ambitious, and he just has this incredible drive, and is determined to get that.
This book has gotten just tremendous reviews, and a lot of them point out that one of the things that you do in this book that maybe other historians have not is really focus on the Boers as a culture and what led to the war and what their leaders were like. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think many Americans don't know much about the Boer War, but it has very interesting parallels for our country. So the Boers were largely Dutch, German, and Huguenot immigrants who had been living in South Africa for centuries. They were very, very religious. They were unabashedly racist. They were stubbornly independent. So most of what they wanted was to be left alone. So in 1835, just 2 years after the British Empire had abolished slavery, the Boers made what they called the Great Trek. So they moved hundreds of miles from the Cape to get away from the British Empire into the interior of Africa. And they established 3 Boer republics at that time. And they continued to just want autonomy. And unfortunately for them, both gold and diamonds were discovered on their land. Which at the time, Paul Kruger, who had become president of one of the republics at Transvaal, said that this gold will cause our country to be soaked in blood. And he was absolutely right. So just a few years later, in 1880, the first Boer War broke out. And so between the British and the Boers, and so you fast forward nearly 20 years, same problem. British still want their land, the Boers still want their independence.
And so he goes to South Africa as a correspondent. Not as a fighter, hops on a train, and what happens?
So he is only there. So the war breaks out in October. He's on a ship just 3 days later. Makes it to South Africa. Quickly makes it to the front, which is then Ladysmith, which is just south of Pretoria. It's the Boers have it under siege. He wants to get as close as he can. And so he gets on an armored train, which, as he said, seems, this great idea, but it's incredibly, incredibly vulnerable if you think about it. I mean, it's on tracks, right? And the Boers just have to watch it go by, and they know it'll come back, and they can attack it. And so they're this very invisible enemy. They know the South African felt very well. They're incredible marksmen. They just wear the same clothes that they wear every day of their lives, no uniforms, anything, so this dusty brown and gray, and they have smokeless gunpowder, very good weapons, and they're silently watching this armored train go by. As soon as it passes, they go to the bottom of a hill, they pile stones on the tracks, and then they go to the top of the hill. They wait for the train to come back, they fire on it, the train does exactly what they want it to do, goes as fast as it can down the hill, and it crashes into these rocks. The first two trains are catapulted off the tracks. Several men are killed. More men are horribly wounded, and they're under this hailstorm of bullets and shells. And Winston Churchill, who again is 24 years old, one of the few civilians on the train, he immediately takes charge of the defense. And he jumps out and he starts shouting orders, organizing everybody, even though there are legitimate uniformed soldiers. I mean, most of the people are actually members of the military, and their commander is right there. And all of them are taking orders from Winston Churchill.
And so he gets captured, taken to prison. How is he received at prison there in South Africa?
So I'll also just say that some of the men did make it out alive, and most of the men actually made it back to their camp alive, and all of them, you can read all the newspaper accounts, credit Winston Churchill's resourcefulness and bravery for saving their lives. But Churchill had gone back to help some of the people who were wounded, and he's captured, and he's furious. And because he thinks all these opportunities, for gallantry and for recognition, this exciting war is going to be going on without me. And he's taken to this POW camp in Pretoria. And he knows also that they're going to be watching him especially, because not only is he the son of Lord Randolph Churchill, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer and leader of the House of Commons, but all the Boers hate Randolph Churchill, because Randolph Churchill, Winston's father, had been there about 8 years earlier and had written letters home that were published in British newspapers just excoriating the Boers, talking about how backward they are, and especially berating them for their treatment of native Africans. And so the Boers were very aware of who Winston Churchill was, and they were thrilled to have them as their captain.
One of the kind of comic relief moments, at least for me in reading this, are his letters home to his mother. Can you talk about that and the approach that he's taking when he's in jail, what he's asking for?
So he wants to get out of prison, and his first approach, he thinks, is, hey, I'm not a soldier, I'm not an officer, I'm not a member of the military. So he's telling everybody he can, and he writes to his mother, and he has a young love interest at that time, he writes to her, knowing that the Boers are reading all of his letters, and he's writing to everybody he can in the Boer government saying, I didn't do anything, I'm just a war correspondent. And they're like, we saw what you did. We know, and we read the newspaper accounts. We know what you did. So he's stuck there, and there's just nothing he can do about it except escape.
What's the plan there?
So his first thoughts about escape, being Winston Churchill, is he doesn't think, I'll just quietly try to plan some escape by myself. No, his plan is to take over the entire prison, and then take over the whole prison where the soldiers are kept, and then take over Pretoria, and then kidnap the president and end the war. So that's his plan. And so everybody else, these sort of older officers in this prison are just like, oh, get away from me, kid, just leave me alone. And so he overhears two men. One is Almer Halton, who was his friend, who was actually the commander on the armored train that was attacked and had invited him to come along. And another guy named Adam Baraki, who's this really scrappy guy who had been in South Africa for quite a while, knew the area really well, and spoke Afrikaans, the Boer language, and Zulu. And so he overhears them with a very quiet, reasonable plan, and that is that in the prison yard, there's a 6.5-foot tall iron paling surrounding it and armored guards all the time. But they notice that at night, when the electric lights come on, there's one corner of the yard that's dark. And if the guard turns his back at the right moment, they think they can make it over. And so Churchill hears them and he says, hey, I want in on that plan. And they're like, absolutely not. We're not taking you. First of all, you talk too much. You're going to tell everybody the plan. Secondly, you're too famous. They're going to notice right away if you're gone. And then third, you're not strong enough. We'd have to drag you these 300 miles across the thing. But Almer Halton, his friend who had invited him on the train, feels guilty and says, look, I don't want you to come, and Brocky really doesn't want you to come, but I'll leave it up to you. And Churchill says, I'm coming.
And so, and you start out the book with this. Churchill makes it out. He's sitting there in the dark waiting on the other two guys. What's he do?
So they choose their night, and they keep looking for this opportunity. They keep going. There's a latrine near there that they're going to hide in and wait for their moment to get over. But the guards are just on it that night. They're really, really watching. And so Holden and Brocky are sort of like, it's getting late. Let's go have dinner, and then we'll come back and we'll try again. And Churchill says, well, I'm just going to go over there and just take a look, and I'll meet you back. And he goes. He sees this opportunity. And he doesn't. He goes over the fence, and then he waits and waits. He waits for an hour in these bushes right outside at incredible personal risk. And finally, he was waiting, and he hears them. They're just kind of walking back and forth and kind of speaking Latin and gibberish. And then they say, we can't make it. We can't come. And they have all the provisions. They have everything, and they know the whole plan because they didn't trust him. They didn't tell him anything beyond getting over the fence. So he is stuck. He can't get back in. They would shoot him, and he can't really go forward because he doesn't have anything. He has no way to, again, cross almost 300 miles of enemy territory. But what choice does he have? And being Winston Churchill, he says, all right, I'll give it a shot. I know I'm going to be captured right away, but I'm gonna try it. So he heads off into Pretoria by himself.
And again, this kind of sense of destiny keeps coming up, and him avoiding seeming tragedy at every turn. And he finds a mine, and just finally ups and knocks on the door. What happens?
Right, so it's really interesting, I think, to watch Winston Churchill as he fluctuates. He goes back and forth between incredible cockiness and confidence and despair, and knowing that he has no help, he has very little hope, and he at one point breaks down and prays for guidance. And he's not a religious man, but he knows that the Boers are enraged, they're humiliated, and they are scouring the veldt looking for him. And if they catch him, there's a very real risk that they will kill him. And he prays, and then he sees in the distance fires, and he thinks that it's an African village. And he thinks that, look, the Africans hate the Boers even more than the British do, and they hate them even more than they hate the British. So maybe I'll go there, and maybe I can talk them into giving me a guide, some food, anything. But as he gets closer, he suddenly realizes it's not an African village, it's a colliery. And he stops, and he thinks, he's been hiding for days, just trying to avoid anyone, really terrified for his life. But he's desperate, and he thinks, I'm going to take a chance. And so he steps out of the gloom and he knocks on a door.
Who answers?
So this is where luck comes in, and it's an incredible dose of luck for Winston Churchill. So he knocks on the door of one of the very, very few people in the entire Transvaal Republic who was British. So the Boers, as you might imagine, when the war began, they forced almost all Britons out of the country. But they needed a few of them who were critical to them to run things like collieries. And this man, John Howard, was incredibly capable and skilled, and he was keeping this colliery running. And so, but Winston Churchill doesn't know that. He knocks on this door, and he sort of marvels at himself because this man opens the door, and he makes this lie up out of whole cloth that he thinks of just like right on the spur of the moment. He's like, you know, I'm a Boer, I was on this train, I fell off, I hurt my shoulder, can you help me? And as he's saying it, he realizes, I don't speak Dutch or Afrikaans, I don't know how I'm going to keep this going. And the man just looks at him and says, I think you should come in. And so he follows him into this dark house, and he leads him into this room, and he puts a gun on the table between them. And Churchill didn't realize that this guy had a gun the whole time. And Churchill looks at him and he says, I think I better tell you the truth. And John Howard says, yeah, I think you should. So he says, look, I'm Winston Churchill, I just escaped, and I have a little bit of money, I can pay you, I can get you more if you could help me. And the guy just looks at him and turns around and locks the door. And Churchill's thinking, you know, this is not looking good for me. And the guy turns back to him and thrusts out his hand and shakes his hand. He says, I'm John Howard, I'm English, and I'm going to help you.
So you're the only English guy in the area. Everyone knows that. Where do you hide the son of Randolph Churchill when he shows up at your front door?
So before Churchill got there, Boers got there and had knocked on John Howard's door and had told them that they were searching for Winston Churchill. And there are wanted posters everywhere for him. And Howard is also risking his life. Because he was English, the Boers let him not fight in the war, but if they found out that he was harboring anyone, especially Winston Churchill, at least he would go to prison, but very likely be killed as well. And so he is risking his life, and there are some other men there who are working for him who are also British, and it's a small group of them, and they think we've got to hide him in a shaft, in a coal mine shaft. And it's, as you might imagine, really, really miserable for Winston Churchill. They take him, deep into the ground, and they put him in this one little area that has a tiny bit of ventilation. They give him an old mattress, a chicken, and some candles. And the next morning, they come back to check on him, and he's sitting there in the darkness, and they say, "Why didn't you light your candles?" And he said, "Oh, I couldn't find them." And they said, "Oh, it must have been the rats." And he finds out that there's this huge population of white rats that lives down there with him and has been thriving in this dark, labyrinthine environment. And so constantly when he's there, they're always galloping across him and trying to steal his candles and his food and things like that. And he's actually kind of okay with the rats, but he's absolutely miserable underground. And they try to bring him out to walk at night a little bit, but it's really dangerous for all of them. But finally they take pity on him after a few days, and they move him to John Howard's office, to sort of a secret room in the back.
You've written about both Theodore Roosevelt and Churchill, very well-known figures, as I mentioned earlier. When you start out writing about them, were there surprises about either of them that you discovered when you were writing your books? Were there maybe preconceived notions that you had about them that you realized maybe weren't correct in the course of your work?
Well, I'll also, just first of all, say how much I think they're alike, and I kept thinking this again and again and again when I was writing about Winston Churchill or reading about him, researching him, how similar he is to Theodore Roosevelt. They're both incredibly ambitious, incredibly arrogant, incredibly well-read, stunningly gifted writers. They have so much in common, and I think that's why they really did not like each other at all. They met, and it wasn't a love affair, to say the least. But what's really interesting to me about these stories, these moments in time, so this is, for Theodore Roosevelt, it's at the end of his life, it's after his active political career, and he dies just 5 years later, and he's in and out of hospitals, and he blames it all on sort of what happened to him in Brazil. He just never really recovers. And obviously for Winston Churchill, this is the beginning of his life. He's 24, he lives to be 90 years old. You know, he has this incredibly crowded and famous life going forward. But to me, at least, and I hope to the reader, both moments are very, very illuminating about who these men were as people. Sort of really, I think, reveals their nature. And I was talking at lunch today because I think often when we look back in history, that what catches our eye and what we remember are the large public moments, or the big moments of triumph or of tragedy or of infamy. But what interests me are the private moments of struggle, when somebody is sick or scared or grieving or desperate. And I think that's when their true nature is revealed. You know, James Garfield called it the bed of the sea, that you can really see who someone is. And I think that's such a beautiful and clear-eyed way to describe it. And certainly Theodore Roosevelt on the River of Doubt, when he's too ill to go on and he thinks he's going to endanger the other men, and is prepared to take his own life and is terrified for the life of his son who's with him. And Winston Churchill, when he is alone on the South African veldt and is terrified for his life and his future, and all that he believes is laid out before him and just beyond his grasp. And you can really, I think, see who he was as a man. And all of these qualities that we associate with him during World War II are in sharp relief here. His ingenuity, his audacity, his determination, his wit, his agility, his grit. All of these we can see very, very clearly here. And it ended up proving to him everything he believed about himself. And so he always had this innate confidence, but here he does it, and he does it alone, and he knows he can do it, and that carries him through the rest of his life.
As a writer, a great writer, in my opinion, how do Winston Churchill and TR stack up as authors?
They're absolutely extraordinary. I mean, I really have to say, I've always felt with Theodore Roosevelt, you know, I love writing about these men because they make me look good. So I can just quote them, and it's in my book, so it makes me look great. But it's the same with Winston Churchill, and it's really interesting. Again, at such a young age, he's so incredibly articulate. And because I read so many different newspaper accounts of the war that were written at this time, and he's just another journalist, but he is head and shoulders above the other writers. I mean, it's just, first of all, he's incredibly ambitious and intrepid, and so he's always getting to where the action is, so he's great at covering these events. He's also, his analysis is brilliant, but his prose is just so beautiful, and it's really impressive. And this is, it's how he supported himself for his whole life, and obviously, Roosevelt won the Nobel Prize for Peace. Churchill won it for literature.
By himself, and as certainly as you guys have described his character tonight, this would be a guy that I wouldn't be surprised if when he tells stories, the fish gets bigger. Were there moments where you had to fact check him, where you found conflicting things, where he was making this out to be, a more vainglorious and amazing story than in fact it was?
He's actually not alone that much in the story, so that was nice for me, because, for instance, with the armored train attack, Halden, who was his friend, who was the commander on this train, he writes about it. He says exactly what, and in fact, Churchill was trying to sort of downplay his role in it because he was trying to get out of prison, right? And so he tried, and then all the newspaper accounts, all the men who made it out, they all talk about exactly what Winston Churchill did, and so you can see, and it all lines up. And the same with the escape. Halton wrote about it, Brocky wrote about it, and the same with Churchill, and it does land. And when he makes it to this colliery, John Howard, the man who helped him, Bynum, who's the guy who actually they end up sticking him in a wool truck, one of Burnham's wool trucks, to finally get the last 100 or so miles into Portuguese East Africa. They write letters to him telling him all the other things, and it all corroborates. So there's the only time he's really alone is between when he escapes, when he leaves Pretoria, and when he makes it to the colliery. And he doesn't, there's nothing where he's saying, I was so brave and I was taking all these chances. On the contrary, he is sort of open about his desperation and his fears, and so I don't think there actually was a lot of exaggeration in his accounts.
Yes, sir. Seth.
Could you tell us about your research process and tactics? Like, do you get everything on note cards, and then your writing process? Do you write daily in the mornings, or those two things?
Sure, my writing process. So as I was saying, I really love doing the research, and so it takes me usually about 4 years to write a book, and the first year and a half are spent just doing very, very general research, just gathering everything I can have. And a lot of it won't actually make it into the book, but all of it helps me understand, and I think that helps the book. And so then I spent another year and a half just trying to absorb it all, reading and organizing it, and sometimes feeling very desperate myself and thinking I'm drowning in all this material, I'm never going to get through it, but just trying to organize it. And so, and I'm very old school about it, so everything I read, I highlight and I underline and I annotate, and it's one little weird thing that I've developed just kind of along the way is if I'm reading something, say like I'm reading Churchill's book, My Early Life, and I come to something that's interesting, I'll put a star next to it, so when I go back I can find it. If I find something that's like, wow, that's really interesting, that's really good, I'm probably going to use it, put 2 stars. If it's like, holy cow, I would be an idiot I cannot forget to use it, I give it 3 stars. And so then when I go back, and this is true if it's letters or diaries or newspaper accounts, whatever, when then I go back through them and I start to organize them and files in my computer, I can quickly find, okay, this goes under the heading of Winston Churchill /childhood /war, or Winston Churchill, his personality, I break that up to like arrogance, ambition, whatever, and so then years down the line when I start to write, I can find it, because it's nothing more frustrating than being like, I know I read that somewhere, where was it, then I can find it, and sometimes it takes me a while, but I have that kind of little system that just works for me. It takes a long time, but it's fun.
And do you, kind of follow up on that, do you have like got to write 10 pages a day or anything like that? How do you pace yourself? I
don't. One of the things that actually helps me is I have 3 children, and they're now getting older. They're 14, 11, and 8. But I always laugh when people say, is writing a book like having a baby? I'm like, all I know is books and babies at this point in my life. For the last 15 years, it's just been books and babies. But what actually helps me is that I have to be disciplined. So I have an office, and my husband has his own company. I have an office there. So every morning I get up, I take a shower, I get dressed, I take the kids to school, and then I walk into my office, I close the door, and I literally go back in time. We were talking about time travel. I feel like it's time travel. I just go to this place and this time with these people. And when I'm done working on a book, I always miss them, because I've spent years with them. And but I know this is what I have. I've got between drop off and pick up, and that's pretty much it. There might be some time on the weekend that I could fit something in, or at night, but I'm usually too tired when after they're in bed, I just go right to sleep. So that's all I have, and I think that knowing that that's it, that's my window, helps me be more disciplined.
Yeah, Barrett.
Earlier at the very beginning, you mentioned that you have all these files of these ideas and things. And I was just curious if you could name 1 or 2 topics that, whether you're interested in writing about them or not, you think are sort of these niche stories in history that need to be written about?
Looking for book ideas, Barrett?
Well, I'll tell you the idea that broke my heart, and none of you can take it, all right? Because I still have these secret dreams of writing it. So, but here's my story, and it's a really good one, but I don't think I can make it work. So years ago, I was just reading, and I came upon this newspaper article about the only house still standing where Benjamin Franklin lived, and it's in London, and he lived there for about 18 years, and it was right before the Revolution. It was during the British Enlightenment, and he's friends with Erasmus Darwin, etc. So this house had fallen into disrepair, and squatters were living in it. It was really a mess, and so this organization, the Friends of Benjamin Franklin, bought it and were renovating it. And they had these guys working in the basement, and this guy found a bone. And then he found another bone and another bone. And he found 1,200 human bones in this basement. And so they called the police, and the police come and they say, you need a forensic anthropologist. So they date these bones to exactly the time when Benjamin Franklin lived in this house. So you're thinking, founding father and serial murder? What is happening? What happened? So what happened is that he rented 2 floors in this house from this widow and her daughter Polly. And Polly married this man named Matthew Hewson, who was a doctor and an anatomist at a time when anatomists were feared and loved, and it was actually illegal to perform autopsies. And get this, so they had a tunnel leading from this house, it was near the Thames, to the Thames. And they would hire these resurrection men, right, these grave robbers, and they would buy these bodies and bring them in. And also, just over on the other side of the garden wall was a gallows. And so they would make deals with these poor guys who are about to be hanged, and they'd be like, look, you're going to be hanged tomorrow, so I'll tell you what, I will give you a new set of clothes for your hanging if you let me have your body when you're done. And so that's how they were getting these bodies in, and it's just extraordinary. And Hewson, right before the revolution, sort of everything falls apart for Franklin because he's a loyalist, right? So he's trying to stop the war from happening. It's all falling apart. He realizes he's wrong. Hewson, who has become like a son to him, cuts his finger during an autopsy and develops septicemia. He dies very quickly, his horrible death. And then just as Franklin is shoved out of the country, back to the United States, Polly goes with him. She's expecting her 3rd child with Hewson. And they still have their descendants in Philadelphia, and many of whom are doctors. And I tracked them down. I mean, I spent a year trying to make this work, and I tracked them down and I said, please, God, tell me that you have a diary that he kept talking about how Franklin was with him. Because I know, and Franklin is a scientist, incredible scientist. He was doing house calls as a doctor. There were no medical schools in the United States at that time. He was bringing medical students to study with Hewson. I know all this, but I don't have dialogue. I don't have proof that he was down. I know it, but I don't have proof that he was down there. And you need that for nonfiction. I mean, I love it when people say my books read like a novel, but it's also important to me that they know that everything is absolutely factual. And that's why I have this huge notes section, so you can go see for yourself if you have a question where I found it. And I couldn't make it work. And the best part of it to me is, and this was going to be my title, the address for this house is 37 Craven Street. So again, nobody take my idea.
Churchill's drive developed from the fact that he was the 2nd son.
Not the Duke.
He was actually the 1st son of his father, but his father was the 3rd son of the 7th Duke. And, I actually think it was a good thing for Churchill and for England and probably for the free world that he didn't inherit the title or the palace. I think Blenheim Palace, like most of those huge family palaces, were a huge burden to the family. In fact, his grandfather and all the dukes before him had been selling things off. They were selling the library, and they were selling the gems, and they were selling the artwork just to try to stay afloat. And it continues to be. They finally, I'm sure some of you have been to Blenheim Palace. They finally opened it up to visitors and things because you can't sustain that. And I don't think that Winston Churchill would have had the freedom to be the man he was had he inherited that.
Yeah.
Could you tell a little bit about how the Boer War was prototypical for counterinsurgency in the modern?
Right, so I mentioned briefly that this is really the beginning of modern warfare. This is some of the first guerrilla fighting. They called it the Khaki War because this is among the first wars in which the British weren't wearing their redcoats, the famous redcoats. They had just sort of bitterly and resentfully given them up to wear these khaki uniforms, which they said made them look like bus drivers. They hated it, but they were still fighting in these perfect, precise lines and were being slaughtered because of it. It's some of the first concentration camps. It's the first time that concentration camps, the term was used, and some of the first sort of wholesale use of concentration camps. So the British, by the end, it starts in October. They think it'll be over by December, and it goes on for almost 3 years. So they go through 3 different commanders-in-chief. The last one being Kitchener, who says, "Done. We're done. We're going to do anything." And so they have the scorched earth policy where they burn farms and they set up these concentration camps because the Boers, who were sort of freely roaming and fighting, would turn to their wives and the homes where they lived and where their children were for food and shelter. And so to deny them that, they put these families in concentration camps, and they also put Native Africans, whom they forced to take part in the war, in concentration camps. And most people who died in the war died in those concentration camps. But the British slowly learned from the Boers. So the British Army going into the Boer War is very different from the one coming out, and it prepared them for World War I.
You had a question, honey?
I know in Destiny of the Republic, and it sounds like you have a lot of science background in addition to your historical. How were you trained as a history writer and historian and science?
So I have a master's degree in English, but I always say my real education was at National Geographic, and so I worked there for 6 years. I was an editor and writer for them, and I worked on just everything. I mean, as you can imagine, that's the best part of working there, because one day, you're working on meerkats, and the next day you're working on a story about a river or a city or planets or something. It was just always something completely different. And the most valuable thing I learned from them is how to do research, and specifically how to find the person who knows better than anyone in the world that one subject that you are researching, because whatever it is you're talking about, there's somebody who spent their life studying it and knows it inside and out. And if you can find them and you can make them your friend, they will help you and they will teach you so much. And it was really interesting to me, though, because I was nervous when I left National Geographic and started writing my first book, because I thought, it's one thing to call somebody up and say, "I'm Candice Millard from National Geographic, will you help me?" A totally different thing to say, "I'm Candice Millard," full stop. And it doesn't have the same ring to it. But amazingly, and thank God, it was the same reaction, because these people are glad that somebody's interested in what they find so fascinating, know so much about, and they're glad that somebody's making the effort to get it right, And these people, I would work with them throughout the process. I would find them early, ask them questions. I would return to them with more questions. I would send them the manuscript, ask to find out what I got wrong, what am I missing. And it's been true for every book, and so that's why I have a huge acknowledgement section, because I have a lot of people to thank.
Okay, I have one last question. So the title, obviously, or the subtitle, is "The Making of Winston Churchill." How does this experience in South Africa make him the man who really saved the British Empire, perhaps Western civilization, just half a century after this?
So, as I mentioned earlier, this does, obviously, it launches his political career, makes him a national hero, and he says himself, it was my electoral victory is because of my popularity coming out of the war. But he also says, interestingly, after he's captured, he says, "This misfortune, could I have foreseen the future, laid the foundations for my later life." And it taught him everything that he believed about himself, he saw was absolutely true. And I think it's most telling and I haven't told the story about the driver, the engine driver, have I? When he jumped out, so forgive me, I've been telling these stories again and again, so I don't want to repeat myself, but when they're under attack, and this is really, really telling about who Winston Churchill was, and the fact that he was a born leader. So he's 24 years old, they're under this incredible attack, he's shouting orders, and the engine driver, the driver of the train, the only man who knows how to move the train, he jumps out of the cab. He's been hit by a splinter from one of the shells. He's bleeding. He's furious. He sees Churchill and he says, "That's it. They don't pay me enough. I'm not a member of the military," and he's going to leave. And Churchill makes this sort of mini St. Crispin's Day speech to him, and he says, "Look, this isn't a terrible thing that's happened to you. On the contrary, this is extraordinary, rare opportunity for you to distinguish yourself. Everyone else is going to be so jealous of you that you had this opportunity for greatness." And the guy looks at him and he's like, "Right." And he turns around and he gets back in the cab and he follows Churchill's every order after that. And what I also love about it is Churchill had said, "Look, I promise you, if you do this, I will make sure that your bravery and your sacrifice is acknowledged and you will get a medal for this." And when Churchill later comes to power and he has the power to do it, he does make sure that that guy gets a medal. So he has this, not only this innate confidence in himself, but it's contagious, it's this infectious confidence that you too believe that you're brave, you too believe that you're resourceful, and you can do great things, and you can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. And obviously, that was hugely, hugely powerful during World War II.
Well, thank you so much for coming.